On March 19, 2024, maintenance workers in the desert near La Mesa, New Mexico, made a grim discovery at the base of a communications tower. There, scattered on the ground, were the partial skeletal remains of a young man, along with a cell phone containing selfies, presumably of this unknown man. The remains were incomplete. Notably, no skull was present, and had likely been exposed to the elements for some time. With no wallet or identification, the unknown victim was designated the Donna Ana County John Doe, after the location in which he was found. Examination of the skeletal remains by forensic experts yielded a basic profile. The John Doe was determined to be male, likely between 18 and 20 years old. He was estimated at a height of around 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 5 inches tall. Analysis of his potential facial features was impossible since his skull was missing, but the selfies suggested the man was Hispanic or Native American. No obvious signs of trauma were noted on the bones that were recovered, and no cause of death could be determined. The condition of the remains was consistent with a death that had occurred months or even years prior. Investigators didn't find any clothing or personal effects apart from the cell phone. Notably, because actual photographs of the man were available from the phone, authorities didn't need to commission a forensic artist for a facial reconstruction. Instead, they had the man's own pictures, a rare situation in an unidentified person case, as a starting point to identify him. The cell phone images show a dark-haired young man appearing to be outdoors in a desert-like area. Unfortunately, the phone itself didn't yield an immediate identity beyond the selfie thought to be from the deceased man. Investigators proceeded to use the clues at hand, the biological profile and the phone pictures, to try to determine who this John Doe was and what happened to him. Early on, missing persons databases in the region were checked for any youth matching the description, but no match was found. As weeks turned into months, the case remained cold. However, with clear pictures of the man's face, it was only a matter of time before someone out there recognized who he was. Meanwhile, in Mexico on June 19, 2022, a man named Jeremias Lopez Santos was officially declared missing to the local authorities. According to the Missing Persons Report, on May 19, 2022, at approximately 4 p.m., the uncle of Jeremias spoke to him briefly over the phone. During this call, his uncle said that he was in Ciudad Juarez, on the border with Texas. Notably, the Mexican Missing Persons Report doesn't indicate what Jeremias intended to do on the border, or if he intended to cross legally or illegally. By February 5th, 2025, an Instagram page announced that the connection between Jeremias and the Donna Ana County John Doe had been made. Notably, he's still listed in the NamUs database as unidentified, so it's not clear if the connection between Jeremias and the John Doe has been officially finalized yet. However, given the visual evidence of the photograph of Jeremias alongside the selfies left on the cell phone, it appears extremely likely that they are the same person. That said, as I mentioned at the start of this segment, the selfies on the phone were assumed to be that of the deceased man. There is always an extremely faint possibility that the phone is actually from another person. At present, to confirm his identity and fully give him his name back, it's likely necessary to test the DNA of the Doe against the family members of Jeremias. So with the identity of the man all but confirmed, that begs the question, what happened to Jeremias? Many believe he succumbed to dehydration after heading toward the communications tower in hopes of finding help or water. Amateur sleuths have suggested that spotting the tower on the horizon might have seemed like a lifeline in the barren landscape. Under this scenario, he likely perished of exposure, simply not having enough water for the desert trek. Notably, comparing his selfies to his missing person photograph suggests he was rapidly going downhill during the last days of his life. Others suggest foul play, questioning if something happened during a human smuggling operation across the US-Mexico border. One variant of this theory suggests that he had promised further payment to a coyote when he entered the States, and when he couldn't produce it, he was dumped in the desert. Another variant suggests that he fell ill during a mass smuggling operation and had become a liability to the whole illegal crossing and was abandoned in the desert to perish. None of these theories have been confirmed as yet, and I hope to have an update on this case in the near future. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. In the early 1980s, a small Colorado publisher released a book that read like a how-to guide for aspiring professionals. It was called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, a slim volume promising to craft the reader into a true pro. Hitman was published in 1983 by Paladin Press, a niche publisher based in Boulder known for its edgy catalog of survival guides, combat manuals, and other forbidden knowledge. The book is presented entirely straight-faced as an instructional manual for less than legal aspiring contract workers. Across its 130 pages, it lays out step-by-step advice on how to enter the business of slaying for hire and get away with it. The author, writing with an authoritative tone, covers everything from selecting a suitable weapon to stalking a target's daily routine. The manual explains how to deal with potential complications, how to avoid leaving evidence, and even how to mislead investigators. The name on the cover, Rex Farrell, was clearly a pseudonym. Translated loosely from Latin, it means Savage King, an appropriately menacing moniker for a purported professional assassin. But the true identity behind that name remained a mystery for many years. The book offered no author biography or credentials beyond the implication that the writer was an experienced hitman, sharing hard-earned secrets from the field. This mystique led some readers to believe they were learning from a genuine pro or someone with special forces training, while others suspected it was all an elaborate hoax to sell books. In time, details about the real author began to surface, adding a surprising twist to the story. According to later media investigations, the author was a woman with no record of violence or military background. She was described as a divorced mom living in Florida who had simply done her research and exercised a dark imagination. Rather than drawing on personal criminal experience, she had built the book's instructions by piecing together information from crime novels, movies, and interviews. In other words, Hitman was essentially a work of fiction packaged as fact. Or at least that's what the official story has been. But digging a bit below the surface, no one has actually shown the receipts on this issue. Notably, the author's identity was kept anonymous as Paladin Press refused to reveal her name or provide any details beyond her being a true crime mom with an active imagination. However, some speculate that Paladin's claim was actually a cover story, attempting to pass the work off as fiction to avoid liability. The line of reasoning is simple. This would have transformed the book from a literal how-to manual into a dark crime novel. The entire thing, including the marketing, would be a form of literary and artistic expression, rather than a literal guide for quote-unquote independent contractors. It would make the publishing of the book essentially the equivalent to producing and broadcasting an episode of Dexter. Unfortunately, whatever the truth about the author, the book would go on to have dire physical consequences. For years, Hitman existed in a sort of twilight zone, widely considered tasteless and extreme, but seemingly harmless in the sense that no known crimes had been directly linked to it. That changed on March 3rd, 1993, when a brutal triple slaying in Maryland suddenly cast a harsh spotlight on the book. On that day, a man named James Perry entered a home in Silver Spring, Maryland, and carried out an act that was as methodical as it was horrifying. Perry had been hired by Lawrence Horn, a disturbed father locked in a bitter dispute over money with his ex-wife. Horn stood to gain a large trust fund inheritance if his disabled son and the boy's mother were dead, a motive straight out of a crime novel, except it was all too real. Under Horn's direction, James Perry drove from out of state and invaded the Horn family's home. Inside, Perry ended 3 people with chilling precision, with Mildred, Trevor, and Janice Saunders, Trevor's full-time nurse, all perishing that night. In the aftermath, investigators found the scene curiously professional in its approach, the kind of meticulous, detached work that seemed uncommon for an ordinary criminal. Given the significant wealth associated with the Horn family and the bitter dispute, the authorities suspected the husband may have had a guy on retainer. It wasn't long before detectives uncovered a trail leading back to James Perry. What truly stunned them was the discovery that Perry owned a copy of Hitman and had apparently used it as his blueprint. Phone records and receipts showed Perry had ordered the book, along with a guide to building silencers, from Paladin Press prior to the slayings. As the case developed, evidence mounted that Perry followed the manual's advice in exacting detail. Perry had essentially acted out the pages of Hitman, turning theory into reality. Both James Perry and Lawrence Horn were eventually caught and convicted, and Horn was identified as the mastermind, and Perry as the triggerman who committed them. In 1995, relatives of Mildred Horn, Trevor Horn, and Janice Saunders filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Paladin Press. They argued that Hitman was not protected speech, but rather a form of criminal facilitation. Their claim was essentially that Paladin Press, by publishing the manual and knowingly selling it to customers like Perry, shared responsibility for the slayings. This legal argument was virtually unheard of in American courts. Never before had a book publisher been sued for providing instructions that a reader used it to commit such an offense. Paladin Press's defense leaned heavily on the First Amendment. Their lawyers contended that however distasteful Hitman might be, it was a published work of information and was thus safeguarded by free speech precedent. Initially, this argument found traction, and they were successful at getting the case summarily dismissed without a trial. In 1996, a federal judge acknowledged that the book was disturbing and improper, but nevertheless dismissed the lawsuit on First Amendment grounds. He reasoned that written instructions, in and of themselves, didn't constitute a direct incitement to imminent violence under established legal standards. Paladin's victory at that stage seemed to affirm the traditional stance that even the most objectionable speech is protected unless it very explicitly incites a crime. However, the story didn't end there. The victims' families appealed, and in 1997 the case reached the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. In a landmark decision, the appellate judges reversed the earlier ruling. They concluded that Hitman went beyond abstract advocacy of violence. It was effectively aiding and abetting crime by providing detailed practical instructions specifically intended for criminals. The court noted that Paladin Press had even stipulated that they marketed the book to people contemplating crimes. Further, they marketed complementary materials which an aspiring troublemaker could utilize in concert with the instructions given by the author of Hitman. This was a crucial point. Unlike a political manifesto or a violent movie, Hitman was part of an entire apparatus set up by Paladin Press to facilitate the establishment of these services. To go back to the Dexter analogy, imperfect as it is, Imagine you're watching the show and all the advertising is intentionally for items which Dexter uses on the show. And not only that, the ads explicitly state that you should buy the items to do what you see being done on screen. With the appellate decision, the matter was kicked back to the lower courts for a trial, which would ultimately never occur. Facing the prospect of a trial by jury and potentially enormous damages, Paladin Press's insurance company chose to settle the case in 1999. Paladin Press agreed to cease publication of Hitman permanently and to destroy any remaining copies in its inventory. Notably, since the matter never went to trial and was settled out of court, Paladin Press was never actually compelled to produce who the author was. Whether Rex Farrell was a true crime mom with a vivid imagination or an actual pro with real know-how will likely remain an unsolved mystery. In the late 15th century, a quiet convent in Germany became the unlikely epicenter of a bizarre outbreak. It began with a single nun who, without apparent reason, felt an irresistible urge to bite her fellow sisters. This nun lunged and bit one companion after another, and before long the strange impulse had spread. Soon every nun in that convent was caught up in a frenzy of biting. The contagion didn't stop at the convent's walls. As word of the biting nuns spread through the region, other nuns in other convents began exhibiting the same startling behavior, almost as if the very idea were infectious. According to later accounts, news of the initial incident passed throughout Germany, before working its way into other regions. From there, the biting mania then jumped to neighboring countries, even reaching as far away as Rome. In the superstitious climate of the late Middle Ages, the immediate assumption was often supernatural. Many concluded that the nuns must have been possessed by demons or some sort of spiritual affliction. Priests reasoned that if the cause was not an obvious physical illness, it had to be the work of the devil and his minions. The convents convened special prayers and masses, imploring divine help for the afflicted sisters. When prayer alone failed to calm the biting frenzy, the church escalated to exorcisms. These formal rituals were intended to cast out evil spirits that they believed were prompting the nuns to behave like wild animals. These religious remedies, however, had no effect on the outbreak. According to much later tellings, the attempts to exorcise the so-called demons only made matters worse by intensifying the nuns' own fear. Hearing that the devil might be loose among them sent the most impressionable sisters into panic, so that they too felt the urge to bite. In essence, the very belief that they were bewitched helped the contagion spread even faster. With exorcisms failing and the biting epidemic only growing, the secular authorities decided to intervene with more direct measures. Local officials and physicians were called in to stop the madness before it spread further. They abandoned any supernatural explanation and addressed the situation in the most literal way possible. The nuns were firmly told that there was nothing demonic happening, and that the compulsion to bite was not a curse, but a figment of their own imagination. What could have caused such an outbreak in the first place? With the benefit of hindsight, modern scholars classify the biting nuns episode as a classic case of mass hysteria, or what today might be termed mass psychogenic illness. In essence, this means there was no physical pathogen. It was a psychological phenomenon in which mental stress and suggestion led to real physical actions. Mass hysterias tend to occur in places where tightly bound groups of people live under pressure, and medieval convents fit the bill exactly. At that time, many young women were forced by their families to enter convent life. Once inside, they had to endure an austere existence that demanded constant obedience, poverty, and long hours of labor and study. These nuns lived cloistered from the world, in what were essentially communal, high-stress conditions. not of their own choosing. It's not hard to imagine the psychological strain this could create on these women. Frustrations and fears would build up in such an environment, even if unspoken. We know today that such pent-up stress can sometimes find unusual outlets. In the terminology of modern psychology, the nuns may have been experiencing a conversion disorder. This is when an emotional or psychological conflict is unconsciously converted into unusual physical behavior, in this case, compulsive biting. But here, there's also the element of mass psychogenic illness, indicating that this spread throughout these very tight-knit and isolated communities. Notably, in an interesting twist, there is a further mystery associated with the biting nuns that isn't often discussed. It's very possible the story of the biting nuns was exaggerated or even invented. There's no solid contemporary evidence, no surviving convent records, and most accounts come from much later writers who summarize sources that are now lost to us. That said, the main source which is cited for the biting nuns case is Justus Hecker, a highly respected 19th century German physician. Given his stellar reputation, historians of medicine generally believe that he was legitimately working with sources that are now simply lost in the two intervening centuries. On the afternoon of July 31st, 2001, a group of people walking along the banks of the main river in Frankfurt's Nied district noticed a strange bundle floating along. And just a quick programming note on this case. I found out about it way back when I started this series, and I tried to do a write-up on the case a few times, but found myself sickened by the details. But ultimately, I think it's an important case to cover, and based upon recent developments, there may actually be some measure of justice here soon. Around 3 o'clock, the observers realized the bundle was actually a human body wrapped tightly in bedding. Police were alerted, and soon authorities pulled from the river the body of a young woman. The corpse had been curled into a fetal position, enclosed in a bedspread and a terry cloth sheet, all tied securely with braided cloth belts common in Afghanistan. An umbrella base was tied to the body, likely meant to weigh it down and send it to the bottom of the river. However, the weight hadn't been enough, and the bundle stayed afloat, leading to the grim discovery. At the autopsy, forensic examiners determined the victim wasn't an adult woman as initially thought, but was approximately 16 years old. She was small and malnourished for her age, and doctors noted that her developmental stage was more typical of a 13-year-old, suggesting she had been chronically underfed. The girl had shoulder-length dark brown hair and a fair complexion. Her eye color couldn't be determined post-mortem, but her face was still in relatively recognizable condition. There was no clothing on the body, and no personal identification, absolutely nothing that immediately answered who she was. What the autopsy did reveal was a harrowing catalog of injuries, both recent and old. Disturbingly, her entire body bore evidence of prolonged and severe abuse. She had numerous scars across her legs, torso, and even her forehead. There were also multiple round burn marks on her skin, suggesting repeated disturbing acts committed against this innocent kid. One of the most telling injuries was to her left ear. The cartilage was deformed into a cauliflower ear shape, a condition usually caused by blunt trauma or constant battering, and commonly seen in pro fighters. This sadly means that she was almost certainly subject to constant hitting in this region over a prolonged period of time. Both of the girl's upper arms had been broken at some point in the past and had healed improperly, leaving her arms visibly misshapen from untreated fractures. All these old wounds had never received medical care, and they simply mended on their own, painfully and imperfectly. There were even indications of even more sinister abuse uncovered in the examination, adding another tragic dimension to the abuse she endured. The cause of the girl's death was found to be blunt force trauma to her chest and abdomen, the final brutal beating after years of torment. Two of her ribs had been violently fractured, puncturing vital organs, and the trauma injured her lungs and spleen, which led to fatal internal bleeding. Forensic timing showed that her death likely occurred 2 or 3 days before her body was found. The perpetrators then kept her corpse for a short time and ultimately dumped her in the river, hoping she would never be found. Frankfurt police opened an investigation immediately, faced with the daunting task of identifying both the young victim and those responsible. With no name to go on, she became known in the press and case files simply as the girl from the Main, a moniker reflecting the river that carried her. Early on, investigators realized this case was highly unusual and disturbing. A teenage girl had been held and abused for years, yet no missing persons report matched her description. This suggested that whoever was responsible had kept her existence a secret from society. The items used in disposing of her body provided the first clues. The ropes binding the bundle stood out as they are commonly worn in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. That detail immediately led police to suspect an international dimension to the case. Perhaps the girl herself was originally from that region, or her captors were. Could she have been brought to Germany from South or Central Asia and kept hidden? It was and remains a critical line of inquiry. Investigators considered that the victim might have lived as a quote-unquote domestic servant in a household of foreign nationals from that region. In particular, one disturbing theory gained traction. The girl could have been part of a diplomat's household. If a family from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border area had come to Germany and secretly brought a child with them to work as a maid, it might explain her origins. In such a scenario, diplomatic immunity could shield the perpetrators from scrutiny, making it extremely difficult for police to investigate them. This chilling hypothesis wasn't something the authorities took lightly, and they didn't rule it out even as they pursued all leads. The inquiry spanned well beyond Frankfurt. German authorities made efforts to reach out internationally in hopes of identifying the girl. Thousands of flyers and posters describing the victim were distributed in multiple languages across Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan. The idea was that someone in her place of origin, perhaps a relative, a neighbor, or a community member, might recognize the description of a missing girl. By the 2010s, forensic science had advanced in ways that offered new hope for cold cases like this. The German Federal Criminal Police undertook more specialized analyses of the girl's remains. Isotope analysis, a technique that examines chemical signatures in teeth and bones, provided an astonishing picture of the girl's probable life history. Scientists determined that her early childhood was likely spent in Afghanistan or Pakistan, as initially theorized. Furthermore, the isotopes suggested she came to Germany at a very young age, probably when she was about 5 years of age. The analysis indicated that for most of her time in Germany, she likely lived in a rural or semi-rural environment. Intriguingly, the chemical markers indicated that in the last roughly 2 years of her life, the girl was living in a more urban area in Germany. Frankfurt, a large city, would fit that finding, suggesting that whoever held her captive may have moved her from a countryside setting to the city not long before her death. Another major effort involved giving the girl from the Main a face that the public could recognize. Using the remains and autopsy data, forensic artists created facial reconstructions to approximate her appearance in life. Because her skull and facial features were largely intact, they could produce a realistic image of a teenage girl with a solemn expression. By 2023, more than 2 decades had passed since the girl's body was found, but the case was far from forgotten. In fact, it became one of the focal cases in a Europe-wide initiative to solve cold cases of unidentified victims. That year, Interpol, in collaboration with national police forces, launched Operation Identify Me, a public appeal campaign to identify unidentified female victims across Western Europe. Initially, in May 2023, the campaign spotlighted 22 unsolved cases in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, inviting leads from worldwide. The response was significant. Authorities received around 1,800 tips in the first phase of the campaign and managed to crack a case. In one instance, a tip even led to the identification of a decades-old victim in Belgium, giving hope that other cases could be solved as well. Encouraged by these results, the operation expanded. In October 2024, a second phase of Operation Identify Me was announced, with new cases entering the spotlight. It was at this time that this case was formally added to the campaign's lineup. Notably, it has been speculated that new DNA profiling techniques will be applied to determine where her family is. Given that she likely comes from a rural region in Afghanistan or Pakistan, it will be significantly more difficult to build out a family tree, given database availabilities. However, investigators are hopeful that other close family members have immigrated to Western countries and have had their DNA logged. While the dominant theory is that she was trafficked to Germany by diplomats, other theories have also been put forth. And trust me, these theories are perhaps even more horrifying. One theory suggests she could have been brought to Germany as part of an even darker trafficking operation to obtain young, quote-unquote, brides. International cheddar piles have been known to engage in this disgusting and heinous practice. However, this theory is speculative and hard to substantiate with the available evidence. If, however, her family can be identified, this theory may eventually be confirmed, as they may have been in on this disgusting scheme. I hope to have an update on this case given the investigative efforts spurred on by Interpol. Anyway, let's discuss something a bit more lighthearted next, shall we? Across the remote mountains and steppes of Central Asia, stories persist of a mysterious ape-like wild man known as the Almas. The name Almas, Mongolian for wild man, appears in the folklore of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and parts of Russia. Described as a human-like creature covered in hair and living far from civilization, the Almas has long been a subject of local legend. Unlike the gigantic Himalayan Yeti or North America's Sasquatch, the Almas is usually portrayed as man-sized and more human in appearance and behavior. Tales of wild, hairy humanoids roaming Central Asia have been recorded for centuries. One of the earliest written accounts comes from the 15th century. German traveler Hans Schiltberger was taken captive and forced through Mongolia. He wrote in 1427 that he encountered man-like savages living in the mountains. He described them as covered head to toe in hair, running wild in the hills, and eating leaves and grass. Schiltberger even claimed that a local Khan captured a male and female of these wild folk and presented them at court. This is one of the first European reports of the creatures later identified with the Almas, indicating that the legend was already well established in Mongolia by the Middle Ages. During the 19th century, interest in the Almas grew as Western explorers ventured into Central Asia. In the 1870s, the Russian geographer Nikolai Przewalski heard accounts of a man-beast in Mongolia called Kunguresu. Mongolian guides told him about a creature with a flat, human-like face, a body covered in thick black fur, walking on two legs. It was said to have tremendous strength and nails as sharp as claws, such that locals feared to approach it. The explorer himself was skeptical and thought these might be misidentified bears walking on their hind legs, but his guides insisted the Kunguresu was no bear. Notably, Przewalski confirmed that Alma's lore was part of the traditional knowledge of locals over 400 years after Schiltberger, providing proof this was no passing belief. He observed that a Tibetan medicinal handbook included Alma's parts among other ingredients derived from known animals, implying the creature was accepted as real by traditional healers. The sightings of the creature picked up steam throughout the 20th century. In 1958, Soviet scientists, believing that there may be something worth investigating in these reports, set up what they called the Snowman Commission. They interviewed dozens of witnesses across the Soviet Union and Mongolia, including a Soviet scientist who claimed to have seen a family of the creatures from a distance. By the late 1980s, as the Soviets were on the verge of collapse, the commission had logged more than 500 reports of this hairy creature. Unsurprisingly, given the socioeconomic conditions of the former Soviet countries in the 90s, funding for the hunt for the Almas came to a sudden and rapid halt. Though accounts vary, the Almas is generally described as a hairy, human-like biped that appears more primitive than a modern human. Eyewitness descriptions collected over the years portray an animal that stands roughly the height of a human, with a body covered in thick dark hair. The hair is said to be long and shaggy, covering most of the body except for parts of the face, hands, and feet. The facial features of the Almas are often described as distinctly human-like, but with ape-like traits. For example, witnesses speak of a flat nose, a protruding brow ridge, and a weak or absent chin. Behaviorally, the Almas is depicted as shy and reclusive, generally avoiding contact with humans. They are usually seen alone or in small family groups, suggesting a primitive family structure. The Almas is not typically portrayed as overtly hostile, and accounts indicate that at worst it will make threatening gestures if approached. Notably, according to Mongolian and Kazakh accounts, they don't have their own human-like language, but rather communicate by grunting. Mainstream science has understandably viewed the Almas as part of folklore rather than a biological reality. Anthropologists and biologists note that despite the many tales, physical evidence for the Almas is lacking. Expeditions and researchers have not found any skeletal remains, and hair samples have invariably turned out to belong to known animals when tested. Notably, as initially guessed in the 19th century, the hair samples have almost all turned out to be from bears. And this is where the mainstream scientific consensus largely stands today. Sightings of the creature are actually just bears walking on their hind legs, seen from a distance. Personally, the idea of a Soviet scientist seeing a family of curious bears and reporting an Almas sighting is somewhat amusing, and I'm really not quite sure why. That said, there's one intriguing alternative explanation that has been proposed. Rather than literal survival of an ancient hominid, some anthropologists propose that early humans' encounters with other species could have left an imprint in folklore. In other words, as Homo sapiens spread through Asia, they might have met Neanderthals and Denisovans. These encounters could have been remembered in stories long after those other hominids vanished. Of course, this hypothesis is very difficult to prove, and it requires that oral traditions transmit memories over tens of thousands of years, which is a highly contentious idea itself. Cryptozoologists take an entirely different approach, believing that the creature isn't just some long-preserved memory, but a living being. According to this theory, the Almas has managed to survive in isolated groups in this extremely sparsely populated area of the world. They point out that Central Asia is home to the Gobi bear, an animal which is virtually never seen, given that there are an estimated 40 to 50 bears left in the wild. The line of reasoning goes that if Central Asia can harbor a small population of bears that goes virtually unseen, the Almas could also still exist in the wild as well.